So I read your comments and I saw that most of you are not that familiar with the history of Canada, but you've all enjoyed the video and you were all excited for part 2. So let me tell you that makes me really happy because this is a topic that I really had a lot of fun researching and learning about. This week, we'll finish off our story and really see how Canada became its own independent colony. And if you haven't seen part 1, I strongly encourage you to go check that out first because it has a lot of background information that'll be useful in understanding this video. You're kind of going to be lost if you don't watch it. So without further ado, let's get started. Welcome to Pugs of Knowledge. So let's just recap a little bit what happened up until now. First, the indigenous people crossed the ice from Russia to Alaska and made their way to the American continent. Unfortunately, the Ice Age was still going on at that time, and that really prevented them from going further into Canada. After some thousands of years, the ice eventually melted and they were finally able to explore this vast piece of land that was to become so crucial to the development of the entire world. They were arguably the very first colonists of the American continent, and they were the reason why the Europeans found people there in the first place. Fast forward a few thousand years again, and in 1492 we have Christopher Columbus, who officially arrives in the Caribbean and claims that land for Spain. Spain then became the very first major European power to colonize the American continent. The Colonial Era had just begun. After Spain, in 1497, it was the British who came to what is today called the United States, and a few years after that it was the French who went up north to Newfoundland. Within the span of like a few decades, all three major European powers had reached the American continent and each began colonizing. Where we left off in part 1, the 7-Year War had just finished, Britain had officially won, and they kicked out France of the American continent and took over all of its colonies. Britain and Spain were now the only people left in the northern part of the American continent. So let's continue our story. What was previously called La Nouvelle France now became the province of Quebec. The British, they treated the locals fairly, they kept their laws and customs to really ensure a peaceful transition. It'll be important to remember that this area was and remained mostly French. This was the year 1773, 3 years before the start of the American Revolution. Remember how in part 1 I said that Canada was involved in the American Revolution? Well, now we're going to see just how and exactly what kind of impact the American Revolution had on Canada. For those that are not too familiar, the American Revolution was the movement that started in the British 13 colonies that eventually led to the creation of the United States. People were generally unhappy with the British rule and they wanted their independence. But at that time, Canada was also part of the British colony. So what happened? While most of the action was done in the 13 colonies, you had some support in some areas of the province of Quebec. And after the American Revolution, a lot of loyalists, people who were loyal to the British Crown, they wanted to leave the United States and settle somewhere else. The American Revolution did not take all of Britain's territory in the American continent. They only took the 13 colonies to about our present-day border between Canada and the United States. They never actually managed to take Canada from the British. So the loyalists, instead of going all the way back to Britain, they found it easier to just go up north. Now remember that the province of Quebec had a big majority of French people, and having a lot of British loyalists who all speak English come into Canada was never really going to merge well with those French people. So the British, to sort of provide a quick fix to the solution, they decided to split the province of Quebec into two, Upper and Lower Canada. The terms Upper and Lower simply refer to the territory's position relative to the St. Lawrence River. So if you look at the map from that time, which I have conveniently placed on your screen, you'll see that Upper Canada is south of Lower Canada. That's because the river flows north. Upper Canada was there to accommodate the British loyalists and as a result was mostly English speaking, and Lower Canada is where all of the French people went. It's for that reason that today in modern day Quebec we have a majority of French people and we all speak French. You know, like as a kid, I never really thought about why we all speak French. In last week's episode, I said that we really shouldn't be surprised that there were to be many wars in these American colonies. Like these big powers were never really going to share the territory peacefully. Sooner or later, somebody was going to attack somebody. So it really should not surprise you that what happened next was yet another war, the War of 1812. And this time it was the relatively young United States who declared war on Britain. The reasons for the war were some trade blocks imposed by Britain and the fact that Britain was helping the native Indians against the Americans. The United States wanted to take over Canada from the British and they thought that they could because they expected big support from Canada. The only problem was that in Canada you either had British loyalists who were never going to support that, or descendants of the French colonists who never really wanted to be part of the United States. Even though Britain was heavily involved in the Napoleonic Wars back in Europe, it still managed to have a good defense and stand strong against the United States. The end of the war was literally nothing. They signed a treaty, they gave back their territories, and even handed back their prisoners of war. From that moment on, the borders between Canada and the United States slowly started to cement themselves. The only difference between then and today is the fact that more states joined the United States and more provinces joined Canada, and they all just kind of went westward. After the War of 1812, the United States and Canada kind of just kept it themselves. The only problem now was that the Canadians were starting to rebel too. They were unhappy with the British rule. I mean, they were so far away, but they were still under the control of the British. You see, up to that point, both Canadas could not really make their own laws. They entirely depended on the British for that. It's usually how a colony's political system works. And with the recent revolution in the United States, you can obviously imagine that it must have had some influence on the Canadians too. All the Canadians really wanted was something called a responsible government. And simply put, they wanted to be able to make their own laws and be accountable for their own decisions while still being equal to Britain. And if they couldn't be equal to Britain, well, they would have preferred to just separate. Now, there was some miscommunication between Canada and Britain, so the British, they sent out a man called Lord Durham to investigate the causes of these rebellions. Upon completing his investigation, he brought back with him the Durham Report, in which he laid out some recommendations for Britain to take. Splitting Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada didn't really work as well as they thought. I mean, the French, they were developing a sense of nationalism because of their language, and they weren't going to give it up that easily, so there was always some tension between them and the British government. Durham thought that if you merge both Canadas into one, that would effectively force the French to assimilate, drop their language, and all become English. So in 1840, after his recommendations, both Canadas were merged into one, the United Province of Canada. Now, officially, on paper, that may seem like a very good solution, but in actuality, it really wasn't. I mean, if Britain was to govern successfully, they had to be really careful how they treated the French. I mean, besides the language, it was a whole different culture with even different religions. The Canadians were still not happy with this new setup, so eventually they pushed for a confederation to be virtually independent from the British Crown in all aspects. Like, the political system in place was just not good enough, and the Canadians eventually, they were fed up. Not only was the political situation bad, but the population was growing rapidly. An inter-colony train track was being built to facilitate transport between the colonies, and they were afraid of the United States coming to invade. Like, they had to be able to defend themselves, and they couldn't if they were still under British rule. This was the last step in the history of Canada. On July 1st, 1867, 150 years ago, Britain officially gave Canada independence to govern itself, appoint its own prime minister, and have complete autonomy over its territory, although it never really officially separated from Britain. From then on, and even up until today, Canada is still part of the British Commonwealth. We still have the Queen on our coins, even though we are independent. Like, we see ourselves as Canadians, and the Queen, well, she's just like a figure. She doesn't hold any real power over our country. This change was good. I mean, the Canadians were finally happy that they got their independence, they could build their army and properly defend themselves. And the French people in Canada, they were happy too, because they got the new province of Quebec, which was formerly Lower Canada, and they could make that French. And that's the reason that I also speak French. I live in the province of Quebec, and here we have a majority of French people that all speak French. And as time went on, more provinces and territories joined Canada, and we eventually got to what we have today, 10 provinces and 3 territories. So this pretty much covers the entire history of Canada, and this, by the way, was taught to me in school, but it took them like 5 years to teach me what I could say in just 2 videos. I don't know, I just found that funny. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that you've learned something. So now here are my questions to you. What do you think about Canada, and what do you think about the Canadian people? Like, we are nice people, and it's true that we say sorry for everything. So please leave me a comment. I would love to know, because I want this to be a two-way thing, not just a one-man show where I just do all the talking. I want us to have a conversation, and bonus points for you if you leave a comment. You might get featured in next week's video as a fan of the week. As you know, and as I say at the end of every video, I haven't talked about everything, and the things that I did talk about, I haven't gone into too much detail. That's okay. I'm actually doing this on purpose. I want you guys to go out and research on your own, and maybe learn a thing or two. With that being said, my name has been Cosden. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all Wednesday.